She was giving birth to his baby while her billionaire husband partied with friends. Then his mother called him in fury. "Good morning, my queen flowers. Come on in, get comfortable. Pour yourself something warm if the night calls for it. Mr. Peter has been waiting all day to sit with you a while. Tonight's story asks a question I think every one of us has carried at some point in our lives, whether we ever said it out loud or not. What do you do when the person who was supposed to show up for you doesn't, and the person who steps into that empty space is someone you never expected to lean on at all? This is a story about a young mother named Winnie giving birth to her daughter while her husband was somewhere he never should have been. It's a story about a mother-in-law named Celeste, who spent a lifetime staying quiet and finally found the courage to speak. And it's a story about the difference between a family you're born into and a family you choose to stand beside, even when it costs you something dear to do it. There is heartbreak in this one, Queens. There is real anger, the kind that's earned. But there is also a greenhouse rebuilt board by board, a friendship that grows slow and honest, and a woman who learns, finally, that she was never as alone as she felt that first terrible night. Settle in. Let's begin. The first pain caught me standing barefoot in the nursery, one hand flat against the crib rail Beau had promised to sand smooth and never had. I remember thinking, even as it doubled me over, that the wood was still rough under my palm, and that seemed like the truest thing in the room. I called him first. Of course I called him first. That was the strange arithmetic of my marriage, if I am honest about it now. Beau Calvert had never once, in 3 years, made me doubt that he loved me. He simply believed love was a thing you felt, privately, powerfully, and that the feeling itself excused you from most of the showing up. He'd say it in his easy way, "I'm here, aren't I?" meaning the house, the ring, the name I'd taken. He never seemed to understand that a woman in labor does not need a man who is somewhere in the world loving her. She needs one standing in the doorway. It rang 4 times and dropped into voicemail, his recorded voice bright and careless, telling whoever it was to leave a message, and he'd call right back. I left one. I don't remember what I said. I remember the sound of my own breath between the words, and how strange my voice sounded, asking my husband to please pick up. I thought, absurdly, of calling my own mother next. Luvenia was 2 hours inland in the house I grew up in, working the kind of night shift that didn't stop for anyone's emergency. And even if she'd answered, I knew what I would have heard underneath her worry, the old, tired disappointment she'd never fully hidden since the day I told her I was marrying into that family. Those people don't know how to need anybody, Winnie. Don't go making yourself small, trying to be needed by them. I didn't have the strength that night to be comforted and criticized in the same breath. So I didn't call her at all. I called again 20 minutes later, when the pains had a rhythm to them, ugly and insistent, like something knocking to be let into the house. Voicemail again. I sat on the edge of the bed we shared and watched the tide clock on the dresser, the one Celeste had given us as a wedding gift, its brass hands marking not the hour, but how far out the water had gone. It was low. The whole marsh would be mud flat and grass by now, herons stalking the shallows in the dark. And my husband was somewhere on the mainland with people I had never met, and I was alone in a house that felt, for the first time since I'd moved into it, like it belonged to someone else. I called Celeste. She picked up on the second ring, her voice already sharpened with the particular alertness of a woman who has spent a lifetime being the one who answers. I told her what was happening, and she didn't waste a single word on shock or fuss. "I'm coming," she said. "Don't you dare try to drive yourself." She was there in 11 minutes, still in the house dress she must have thrown a cardigan over, her silver hair loose around her face in a way I had never once seen it. She took one look at me gripping the doorframe and didn't ask where Beau was. She just put her arm under mine and walked me to the car like she'd done this before. Like some part of her had been rehearsing it her whole life without knowing why. The causeway lights strung out gold across the black water as we crossed off the island. and I pressed my forehead to the cool glass between panes and watched them blur. "Try him again," Celeste said, not taking her eyes off the road. "I'll try Garrison's office line. Someone there will know where that dinner is." "Voicemail," I said when I'd tried. My voice cracked on the word. She didn't answer. Her jaw had gone tight in a way I recognized now, having lived alongside her for going on 3 years, as the particular stillness she wore when she was furious and had nowhere yet to put it. At the hospital they moved fast, the kind of fast that is its own kind of frightening, orderly and calm on the surface and urgent underneath. A nurse named Talitha, broad-shouldered and steady-voiced, got me into a gown and onto monitors before I'd finished answering her questions. Celeste stayed exactly where I needed her, which was everywhere at once, smoothing my hair back, holding a cup of ice chips, standing like a wall between me and the door every time it opened, and it wasn't him. Somewhere in the second hour, the monitor's rhythm changed, and I watched Talitha's face change with it, the practiced pleasantness dropping away for just a moment before she caught it and smoothed it back. She said words like decelerating and "let's get the doctor in here now," in a voice pitched to sound unworried, and I understood in the animal part of my brain that no longer cared about tone, that something was wrong. I have tried since to describe that stretch of time to people who weren't in the room, and I have never managed it. It was not like the movies. There was no single scream, no single crash of noise. It was quieter than that and worse, a kind of controlled scrambling. Low urgent voices, hands moving fast without ever once seeming to hurry, as if speed and panic were 2 different languages, and everyone in that room had been trained since birth to speak only the first. I remember the cold press of the mask over my mouth and nose. I remember counting the ceiling tiles because Celeste told me to, in the same voice she might have used to talk a spooked horse back from a fence line. Low and even and certain, Celeste took my hand in both of hers and didn't let go. Not when the doctor came in fast and quiet, not when they turned me onto my side and fitted an oxygen mask over my face, not when the room filled with more people than I could count and someone said the word distress like it was any other word. "Look at me," Celeste said, close to my ear. "Look at me and not at them. You are doing exactly what you need to do." I don't know how long it lasted. Time went strange and thick, the way it does when your body takes over and your mind just holds on. I know that at some point the fear in the room eased, that the numbers on the monitor came back to where they should be, that the doctor's shoulders dropped an inch and stayed dropped. I know that Celeste's hand in mine never once loosened its grip, not even when I was sure I was crushing the bones of it. And I know that when they finally told me to push, really push, I did it with her voice in my ear instead of his. She was born a little after the tide turned, though I didn't know that until later, when Talitha mentioned it while she cleaned up. Said it like a small kindness, a fact to hold on to, a girl, small and furious and perfect, her cry filling that whole white room. And when they laid her on my chest, I forgot, for one long, unbroken minute, that anyone else in the world existed at all. Celeste made a sound I had never heard her make, something caught between a laugh and a sob, and pressed her knuckles to her mouth. "Look at her," she whispered. "Look at what you did." I looked. I memorized the furrow between her eyebrows, the impossible dark fuzz of her hair, the way her whole hand wrapped around one of my fingers like she already knew exactly what she meant to hold on to in this world. And even in that minute, that perfect, unrepeatable minute, some small, ruined part of me was still listening for the door. Talitha came and went, checking numbers, murmuring approval. A different nurse brought me water and helped me shift the baby to nurse for the first time, guiding us both with the patient, unhurried hands of someone who had done this 10,000 times and still found it worth doing gently. Outside the window, past the parking lot lights, I could just make out the dark line of the marsh grass, and I found myself thinking of my grandmother, gone some years now, who used to say a child born on the turn of the tide would never be easy to hold still. I hoped it was true. I hoped my daughter grew up to be difficult to hold still, difficult to talk over, difficult to leave waiting by a phone. It was nearly an hour before Celeste's phone finally connected. She'd stepped into the hallway to try again, the way she'd been doing every 15 minutes since we arrived. And I watched her through the narrow window in the door, watched her go still, watched something move across her face that I had no name for yet. She came back into the room, holding the phone slightly away from her ear, like it had grown too hot to hold close, and for a moment she didn't say anything at all. Celeste. My voice came out raw. What did he say? She looked at me, and then at the baby sleeping against my chest, and something in her expression hardened into a kind of resolve I would not fully understand until much later. He didn't say anything, she said quietly. I don't think he even heard me talking. I could hear the party behind him. Someone was making a toast. Chapter 2. Beau came through the door a little after sunrise, and I smelled him before I saw him, bourbon gone sour with sweat, and underneath it, faint, a woman's perfume that was not mine, though I would spend an unfair number of hours later convincing myself it belonged to nobody in particular. Some stranger brushing past him in a crowded room. Nothing more. He was still in his dinner jacket, tie long gone, top buttons open, and he was holding a bouquet of grocery store carnations still wrapped in plastic. The kind you grab off a cooler rack on your way in the door because you know you've done something wrong, and flowers are what wrongdoing men buy. Winnie. My name came out of him cracked and small. Winnie, baby, I am so sorry. My phone, it was so loud in there. I didn't even feel it buzzing, I swear to God. Don't, Celeste said. She had not raised her voice. She rarely did. But the single word landed in that room like a dropped plate, and Beau actually flinched. Mama, I called you 11 times. Celeste's hands were folded in front of her, perfectly still, and I understood watching her. That stillness was where she kept her rage when there was nowhere safe to put it. 11 times, Beauregard. Your wife was on a table with a mask over her face, and I was standing in a hallway listening to somebody toast you. He went white. What? You didn't hear me, she said, when I finally got through. You didn't hear a word, I said. I could hear the room behind you. He looked at me then, and whatever he saw in my face made him set the carnations down on the rolling tray table like they'd suddenly become too heavy to hold. He came to the side of the bed and reached for my hand, and I let him take it because I was too tired to do anything else. But I did not close my fingers around his. It was the Tidewater account, he said, like that explained anything. Daddy needed it closed tonight. He said the investors were only in town till morning. He said if I left before the papers were signed, it would look like I didn't have the stomach for this business, and I lost track. I'm so sorry. Is she all right? Are you all right? She's all right, I said. My voice came out flatter than I meant it to. No thanks to either of you. Something moved through his face, hurt and shame, tangled together so tightly I couldn't have separated them if I'd tried. He looked down at our daughter, asleep in the little clear bassinet beside my bed, and his whole body seemed to fold a little, like a building giving way floor by floor. Can I hold her? I nodded, because I did not have it in me to say no to that particular request. Not with her right there, not with him looking like a man realizing all at once the size of what he'd missed. He lifted her with more care than I expected, cradling her head the way the nurse had shown me. And for one unguarded moment, his face went soft and stunned and young. And I remembered, despite everything, exactly why I had married him, I thought, watching him hold her. Of the man I'd fallen for in the first place. Not the beau who forgot to charge his phone, but the one who used to drive out to Harrington on Sunday mornings just to sit on my grandmother's porch and listen to her talk about the old families who'd farmed that land before anybody called it valuable. He'd asked good questions. He'd remembered the answers. He'd actually cried at her funeral, standing at the back where he thought no one would notice him. A white boy from the resort side of the island who had somehow made himself part of a family that didn't share his last name. I had believed then that a man who could listen that carefully would know how to show up. I was learning now that listening and showing up were two entirely different muscles, and that no one had ever once made him exercise the second. Celeste watched the two of them for a long moment, and then she stepped to the window, arms crossed, looking out at the parking lot like it had personally offended her. Garrison called it a make-or-break deal, Beau said quietly, still looking down at the baby. You know how he gets. He said, if I walked out on that dinner, it would be the last real assignment he ever trusted me with. He said that to you tonight, Celeste said, without turning around. It wasn't a question. He said it 3 days ago. Tonight he just reminded me. I watched something pass over Celeste's shoulders. A tightening, quick and involuntary, gone before Beau could have seen it even if he'd been looking, which he wasn't. I had lived alongside this family for 3 years now, long enough to know the shorthand of it. And I filed that small flinch away, the way you file away anything you don't yet understand, but sense you will need later. Celeste asked him to step into the hallway with her, and though she kept her voice low, the door didn't latch all the way, and I could hear enough through the gap to understand the shape of it. If not every word. You will not do this to her again, Celeste said. Mama, I know I am not finished. I've spent the better part of my life married to a man who thinks a closed deal is worth more than a held hand. And I let it happen because I told myself that was simply the cost of the life we had. I will not stand in a hospital hallway and watch you build the same marriage out of the same lie. It's not the same. Daddy never. Your father missed the night your sister broke her arm falling off the seawall because he was entertaining buyers from Atlanta. I told everyone he was stuck in traffic. I've been telling that particular lie in one form or another for longer than you have been alive, and I am done telling it. Do you understand me? There was a silence then, long enough that I strained to hear anything at all. And when Beau spoke again, his voice had lost its polish entirely, gone rough and young. I was scared, he said. Is that what you want me to say? I stood outside that hospital for 10 minutes before I even went to the dinner because I could not make myself walk in. I don't know how to do this, Mama. I don't know how to be in that room and not turn into him. Then you had better learn, Celeste said, because that little girl in there does not care how scared you are. She only knows whether or not you showed up. I heard her footsteps first, brisk and certain, and I made my face as neutral as I could manage before she came back through the door. Though I don't think either of us believed for a second that I hadn't heard, a nurse came in to check on us. And in the small bustle of blood pressure cuffs and quiet questions, Beau set the baby back down and stepped away to give the nurse room. His phone, forgotten in his jacket pocket, buzzed once against the vinyl chair, then again, insistent. You should get that, I said. Might be your father wanting to know how the deal closed. He winced at the edge in my voice, but didn't argue with it, and that more than anything else that long morning told me how bad he knew this looked. The old Beau, the porch-sitting, question-asking Beau, would have let the phone ring itself out and stayed exactly where he was. This one crossed the room like a man answering to something he couldn't afford to ignore, even now, even here. And I watched him go with a hollow feeling settling in my chest that had nothing to do with the long night of labor behind me. He crossed to check it anyway, and I watched his face change as he read whatever was on the screen. Not soften, not crumple, but shutter, quick and complete. Like a storefront going dark for the night. Who is it? I asked. Nobody. Work. Beau. He hesitated a beat too long. And then, because some part of him has always been a worse liar than he thinks, he turned the phone face down against his thigh instead of answering me at all. But not before I'd caught the first line of the message glowing on the screen, the sender's name printed plain above it in block letters. I would have known anywhere by now. Garrison Calvert. Don't let this become a habit. Handle your wife before the wrong people start asking questions. I said nothing. I let him slide the phone into his jacket pocket and come back to sit beside the bed and take my hand again, and I let him believe, for a little while longer, that I hadn't seen. But I lay there with our daughter sleeping 3 feet away, and turned that one word over and over in my mind, handle, until it had worn a groove I would not soon forget. Chapter 3. They released us on a grey, close morning, The sky pressed low over the marsh, like a lid over a pot, and Beau drove us home to the guest cottage on the Calvert property with a tenderness so complete it almost undid me. He kept one hand on my knee the whole ride, kept glancing back at the car seat like he expected our daughter to vanish if he looked away too long. I wanted to believe that tenderness meant something had shifted in him permanently. I had wanted to believe a great many things about my husband over the years, and I was learning, slowly, painfully, the difference between wanting to believe something and having any real evidence for it. My mother called that first afternoon, her voice thin with the effort of sounding glad. "Well," Lavinia said, "you did it." "Girl or boy?" "A girl. Marigold. Pretty name." A pause stretched long enough that I could hear the television murmuring behind her, some game show, canned applause. "Was he there?" I didn't answer right away, and she didn't need me to. "I'm not going to say I told you so," she said, which was, of course, exactly what she was saying. "I'm going to say I hope that family knows what they've got in you, because I raised you better than to spend your life waiting on people who can't be bothered to show up. Mama, I don't have it in me today. I know you don't, baby. That's why I'm not calling to fight. I'm calling to say congratulations, and I mean it, and I wish I could get down there to see her, but the shift schedule's what it is." Another pause. "You know I would come if I could." I know, I didn't know, not entirely, but I said it anyway. Because some conversations are easier to end than to finish honestly. And I had a newborn asleep against my shoulder and no strength left over for old wounds. Celeste, by contrast, simply appeared and stayed. She came the first morning with a cooler full of food I hadn't asked for and didn't know I needed. A pot of rice and okra she'd clearly worked to get right. Seasoned the way I made it, rather than the way her own family had ever cooked. And when I asked her about it, she just shrugged like it was nothing. "I called your grandmother's old church and asked one of the mothers there for help," she said. "I didn't want to bring you food that tasted like a stranger's kitchen." She stayed 3 nights running, sleeping on the daybed in the nursery so I could rest, waking before Marigold did, handling the 2 a.m. feedings when my body simply refused to cooperate any longer. I would wake to the sound of her voice in the next room, low and unhurried, telling my daughter stories about a girl who used to run wild on Sea Island before anyone had built a fence around it, and something in my chest would loosen just enough to let me fall back asleep. I did not know, in those first days, how to hold the 2 women in my life side by side without feeling disloyal to one or the other. Lavinia had raised me on her own after my father passed, working doubles at the poultry plant and later the hospital laundry. And she had done it with a fierce, exhausted love that never once let me doubt I was wanted. But love in that house had always come wrapped in warning. Don't trust easy money. Don't let a man's charm do your thinking for you. Don't go setting your whole self down on land you don't own the deed to. I had absorbed every one of those warnings, and married Beau anyway, and some tired, guarded part of my mother had never fully forgiven me for proving her right before I'd even finished the wedding toast. Celeste's love came without warning attached. She simply showed up again and again, with rice and okra and clean towels, and a willingness to sit up all night beside a woman who wasn't, by any blood test, hers to sit up for. I did not know yet what to call a love like that. I only knew I had never had it before, not from anyone, and that some starving part of me had begun, quietly and without my permission, to depend on it. When Beau's Aunt Cornelia stopped by uninvited and made a comment, light and cutting in the way certain women perfect over a lifetime, about how surprised she was that a pastel girl had taken to motherhood so gracefully, Celeste didn't raise her voice. She simply set down her coffee cup, looked Cornelia dead in the eye, and said, "That's my granddaughter's mother you're talking about. Choose your next sentence carefully." Cornelia left shortly after. Garrison came by only once that week, on a Thursday evening, dressed as though he'd stepped out of a boardroom rather than walked across his own back lawn. He stood over the bassinet for exactly as long as courtesy required, studied Marigold's face with the flat, assessing look he might have given a piece of waterfront property, and pronounced her at last a fine addition to the family, in a tone better suited to livestock than a granddaughter. "Thank you," I said, because I could not think of anything else to say to a sentence like that. He turned that same assessing look on me next, and for a moment I understood, with a clarity that frightened me, exactly how he saw me. Not as his son's wife, not as the mother of his first grandchild, but as a variable to be managed, a risk introduced into a portfolio he had spent his whole life protecting. I had met Garrison Calvert exactly 4 times before that night, and each time he had greeted me with the same polished, unreachable courtesy he might have extended to a business associate's spouse, whose name he hadn't quite bothered to learn. He was a tall man, silver-templed, always dressed as if a photographer might arrive at any moment, and he moved through his own home with the careful proprietary air of a man walking a property he was still deciding whether to develop. Beau had told me once early on, half laughing and half not, that his father had never in his memory raised his voice, that he didn't need to, that a certain kind of coldness did more damage delivered quietly than any amount of shouting ever could. I hadn't understood what he meant until I was standing in my own living room, watching that same coldness turn its full attention on me. "Beau tells me you're planning to start some kind of flower business," he said. "Out at that old place on Harrington. My grandmother's land, yes. I'm restoring the packing shed into a growing space. Charming hobby." He said the word the way another man might say infection. "Just be sure it doesn't distract you from what actually matters here. This family has a certain image to maintain, Winnie, and a certain standard of who represents it well. I'd hate for you to embarrass yourself trying to be something you're not." He was already turning for the door by the time the words finished landing, already reaching for his car keys, already, I understood, moving on to whatever mattered more to him than the woman he'd just cut open, standing in her own living room. Celeste, coming in from the kitchen with a fresh pot of coffee, caught only the tail end of it, but she caught enough. I watched her face go still in that particular way I was starting to recognize, and I watched her set the coffee pot down very carefully, as though she did not entirely trust her own hands. "Garrison," she said low. A word. He didn't stop walking. "Not tonight, Celeste." The door closed behind him with a soft, final click, and Celeste stood there a long moment with her back to me, her shoulders rigid before she turned around and tried, not quite successfully, to arrange her face into something gentler. "Don't you let that man tell you what you are," she said. "Not for one single second. Do you hear me?" I nodded because it was easier than admitting how deep his words had already gone, how they'd found the exact soft, unhealed place I'd been protecting since the day I married into this family. The fear that no matter what I built, no matter how well I loved his son or raised his granddaughter, Garrison Calvert would always look at me and see only the land his family had once owned, and the people, like mine, who had once worked it. That night, after Celeste finally went home, and Beau had fallen into the heavy, guilty sleep of a man who did not trust himself to dream, I lay awake with Marigold's small weight rising and falling against my chest, and thought about the packing shed out on Harrington, the one my grandmother had used to cure and bundle greens for half the island, before her hands grew too stiff to keep at it. It was falling in on itself now, roof sagging, the old tin gone soft with rust, but the bones of it were sound. My grandmother had always said a thing built right could take almost any amount of neglect and still be worth saving, so long as somebody finally came along willing to do the work. I did not know yet whether she'd been talking about buildings or about people or about both at once. I only knew I intended to find out. Chapter 4. The sketchbook had sat untouched on my nightstand since before Marigold was born, and it was Celeste who finally put a pencil back in my hand. I had built a small but steady business in the years before I married Beau, arranging flowers for weddings and funerals, and the occasional gallery opening in the village. And I had been proud of it, the way you're proud of something you built yourself, out of nothing, on the strength of your own two hands and your grandmother's old cutting shears. That pride had quietly disappeared somewhere in the first year of my marriage, folded up and put away along with most of my old client list, and I could not, if I was honest, point to the exact day it happened. There had been no single conversation where Beau told me to stop. There had only been a slow accumulation of dinners where his family's friends asked what I did, and Beau answered for me before I could, framing it always as something charming and small, a hobby, the way his father had said it too. And I had let the answer stand, because arguing with it in front of company felt like more trouble than it was worth. It is a strange kind of erosion, watching yourself get smaller one dinner party at a time. You do not notice the shoreline receding until you look down one day and realize how much ground is already gone. "You used to draw arrangements in the margins of everything," she said, one grey morning while Marigold napped between us on the porch swing. "I found an old grocery list of yours once, wedding shower planning, and you'd sketched an entire bouquet of Confederate rose and sweet gum in the corner of it. I kept it. I don't even know why. I haven't had the heart for it lately, I know. That's exactly why I think it's time." She'd already made the call before she told me. "Arrange for a contractor to come look at the old packing shed out on my grandmother's land. See what it would take to make it sound again, standing water damage and all." I told her it wasn't necessary, that I could figure it out myself in time. And she looked at me with the particular patience of a woman who had raised one child already and knew exactly how much resistance to let pass unchallenged. "Winnie, let somebody help you for once, without turning it into a debt you have to repay." The contractor arrived the following week, a broad-shouldered man named Caleb Register, who'd grown up 2 roads over from Harrington and, it turned out, had helped his own grandfather run trot lines with mine back before either of us was born. He walked the shed slowly before he said a word, running his hand along the old heart pine framing, crouching to check the sill for rot. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't about money or timelines at all. "Your grandmother built this to last," he said. "Whoever poured this foundation knew what they were doing. We can save every bit of it. Just need somebody willing to be patient with it." Something in the way he said it settled a knot in my chest I hadn't realized was still tight. He came 3 days a week after that, quiet and steady, never rushing, never making a show of the work the way some men like to when a pretty woman was watching. He talked to me about drainage and rafters, and once, unprompted, about his own mother, gone some years now, who had kept a cutting garden behind their house that the whole neighborhood used to raid for Sunday church flowers. He didn't ask about Beau. He didn't have to. Word travels fast on an island that size, and I understood, without either of us saying it aloud, that he already knew more than he let on. I brought Marigold out to the shed most afternoons, propped in her carrier in whatever patch of shade Caleb had left standing, and she seemed to like the sound of the hammer better than any lullaby I'd tried. One afternoon, he stopped mid-task, looked over at where I was sketching a trellis design in the dirt with a stick because I'd left my good pencil at the house, and without a word went to his truck and came back with a proper notebook. "Brand new, still wrapped in plastic. Saw it at the hardware store," he said, setting it on the sawhorse beside me. "Figured a woman drawing flowers in the dirt needed better paper." I laughed, actually laughed, for what felt like the first time in weeks. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." He was already turning back to the rafters. "Didn't do it because I had to. It was such a small thing, a $5 notebook, and it should not have meant as much as it did. But I had grown so used to gestures that cost a great deal and meant very little. Flowers bought in a panic on the way to apologize. Promises circled on a calendar and broken anyway, that a $5 notebook, given for no reason, except that he'd thought of me standing in the dirt with a stick, felt like the most honest gift I'd been handed in, longer than I wanted to admit. Beau tried, in his own uneven way, to make up ground. He came home earlier some nights. He held Marigold for long stretches, walking her around the living room, singing off-key to keep her settled. He promised to be at her first pediatrician visit, circled the date on the kitchen calendar himself. and then called 40 minutes before to say a call with the Tidewater account investors had run long, and could I just send him pictures instead? I went alone. I always seemed to be going alone. It was 3 days after that missed appointment that I found the folder. I hadn't been looking for anything. I'd gone into Beau's home office to find the good stapler for a stack of receipts from the shed restoration, and there it was, tucked beneath a stack of resort blueprints on the corner of his desk. A manila folder with the Calvert family attorney's letterhead peeking out from beneath the flap. I told myself, even as I reached for it, that I had every right to look at anything in that house. I told myself a great many things in the seconds before I opened it. Inside was a draft document, 3 pages, titled at the top in plain block type, Proposed Parenting Framework. Preliminary. My name appeared 11 times in those 3 pages. I had not written a single word of it, had not been consulted on a single clause, had not even known such a document existed until that moment. Standing alone in my husband's office, with my daughter's whole future laid out in someone else's careful, bloodless legal language, I sat down slowly in Beau's desk chair and read it twice, my hands gone strangely cold. The language was careful in a way that frightened me most. Not cruel on its surface, not obviously false, just precise and bloodless, and utterly certain of its own authority. It referenced a household budget review. It referenced staff availability at the main house, as though nannies and housekeepers were a resource I ought to be grateful to be managed by, rather than a decision that was mine to make. It referenced twice my quote-unquote demonstrated pattern of emotional strain, though I could not for the life of me locate a single incident anywhere. In those 3 pages that amounted to more than a woman who had recently given birth crying in a hospital hallway because her husband hadn't come, on the 2nd page, under a section labeled Custodial Considerations, I found the sentence that would not let go of me for days afterward. The one I read a 3rd time, just to be sure I hadn't imagined it. Given the mother's documented emotional volatility during the postpartum period, primary decision-making authority should reside, at minimum through the child's 1st year, with the paternal household. I set the pages down very carefully on the desk, the way you set down something that might shatter, and I sat there for a long time, listening to my own pulse in my ears. I thought about every tear I had shed in that hospital room, every moment of exhaustion I had let myself have because I believed foolishly that I was surrounded by people who loved me and would never once use my grief against me. I thought about Talitha's steady hands, about Celeste's fierce, unwavering presence, about the ordinary, human weight of bringing a child into the world, while the man who put her there sat somewhere else entirely, laughing at a toast in his own honor, and I understood. Sitting alone in that office with my daughter's future spelled out in someone else's handwriting, that somebody in this family had been watching me far more closely than I had ever thought to watch them. Chapter 5. I waited until Marigold was down for her afternoon nap before I laid the folder on the kitchen table in front of Beau. The pages squared and neat, as though presenting them calmly might keep the rest of the conversation calm too. What is this? He looked at the folder for a long moment before he looked at me, and his face fell in a way that told me he already knew exactly what I'd found. Winnie, it's a draft. It's not final. It's not even really mine. It's Daddy's attorney's language. I haven't signed a single thing. Emotional volatility, Beau. Postpartum period. Paternal household. My voice was steadier than I felt. You let a lawyer write that about me and you didn't say a word. I told him no. He said it fast, almost pleading. The first draft was worse. I made him take out the part about... He stopped himself. The part about what? He rubbed both hands over his face, and when he dropped them, his eyes had the raw, cornered look of a man who has run out of places to hide. There was a section about your family, about Harrington, about whether the land your grandmother left you constituted I don't even remember the exact phrase, an unstable financial environment for a minor. I made him take it out. I fought him on that much, Winnie. I promise you I did. You fought him quietly, in private, and then you let this sit in your desk drawer for God knows how long, without telling me it existed at all, because I didn't know how to tell you, without you thinking I agreed with it. Do you?" The silence that followed was its own answer. Long enough and heavy enough that my chest went cold and still, the particular stillness of a woman deciding in real time exactly how much of herself she can afford to keep handing to a man who won't say no to his own father. "Winnie, come on. You know I don't think you're unstable. I know what you are. I know exactly what you are." His voice cracked on the word no, and for a moment I almost softened toward him, almost let the old habit of comforting him through his own guilt take over the way it always had. I made myself hold still instead. "But Daddy's been talking about optics for weeks now. Ever since the papers ran that piece about the Tabby Point development displacing families out past the Cannon's Point line, he's been paranoid about how this family looks. He thinks a custody question, if it ever became public, would look better handled his way. Buttoned up, controlled. So this isn't even about me," I said slowly. "It's about how I might make him look. That's not—" He stopped, hearing himself. "I don't know how to separate the two anymore. I don't think I ever have." "Then you'd better learn fast." I said, "Because I'm not a line item in your father's portfolio, and neither is our daughter." It was Celeste who broke the silence. Standing in the doorway to the kitchen with an armful of folded laundry she'd clearly frozen mid-step carrying. I hadn't heard her come in. "He doesn't agree with it," she said, her voice low. "He's just never once in his life learned how to tell his father no and mean it." Beau's head snapped toward her. "I watched your father do this to me for the whole of my married life, Beau. Not with lawyers, with silence. With cold shoulders at dinner, and cancelled plans, and 1,000 small ways of letting me know exactly whose comfort mattered more in that house. And I never once fought back, because I told myself fighting back would cost more than it was worth. That keeping the peace was its own kind of strength." She set the laundry down on the counter with hands that weren't quite steady. "There was a summer before you were born when I lost a baby partway through carrying her. Your father was in Charleston closing a deal. I called him. He told me to have the housekeeper drive me to the hospital, and he'd be there when he could. He didn't make it until the next afternoon. I never told anyone that story, not even my own sister, because I decided a long time ago that some griefs were better kept private than used against the family." The kitchen had gone entirely silent, except for the low hum of the refrigerator. Beau looked at his mother like he was seeing her for the first time in his life. And in a way I understood he was. I used to tell myself it was a kind of dignity. Celeste went on quieter now, almost to herself. "Not making a scene. Not airing what happened in this family to outsiders. I thought, if I just kept the house running smooth enough, kept every dinner party perfect enough, I could prove that none of it had really cost me anything. I've spent so many years being proud of how well I hid the cost." She looked at me then, and her eyes were wet, but her voice held steady. "I watched you in that hospital, Winnie, doing the hardest thing a body can do, completely alone except for me, and a door I'd kept sealed shut since before you were born finally broke open. I'm not going to spend what's left of my life being proud of my own silence." I reached across the table and took her hand, and for a moment none of us said anything at all. The three of us standing in that kitchen, with a folder full of cold. Careful legal language sitting between us like a stone none of us knew how to move. "I am not telling you that story, so you'll feel sorry for me," Celeste said, her voice gaining a steel I had never heard in it before. "I am telling you because I will not watch you make my silence into your son's inheritance. If this goes any further, Beauregard, I will not sit quietly the way I did. Do you understand what I am telling you?" He didn't answer. I don't think he could. Caleb came by that same afternoon to finish framing the shed's east wall, and I went out to the land alone, needing the particular quiet of hammer and wood and open sky after a morning that had cracked something open in every direction at once. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just handed me a level and let me hold it steady while he drove the last of the framing nails. And somewhere in the unhurried rhythm of that work, The tightness in my chest began, very slowly, to loosen. "You've got good bones out here," he said when the wall was finally square and true. "Whole structure's sound. Just needed somebody willing to put the work in, instead of tearing it down and starting over." I understood, even then, that he wasn't only talking about the shed. "Can I ask you something?" I said, watching him gather his tools as the light went long and gold across the marsh grass. "Does everybody out here already know? About my marriage, I mean." He considered the question honestly instead of rushing to comfort me, which I'd come to learn was simply how he was built. "Folks talk," he said finally, "but mostly what I hear is people saying, 'You're out here every week, rain or shine, working alongside me to save something your grandmother built.' Nobody who watches you do that thinks less of you, Winnie. If anything, it's the other way around." I didn't have an answer for that. Not one I trusted myself to say out loud, so I busied myself gathering the level and the spare nails while he loaded the truck. And if he noticed how long I stood there afterward, watching his taillights disappear down the sandy lane, he was kind enough never to mention it. The papers came 2 days later, delivered by courier to the front door of the guest cottage, thick and official in a way that made my stomach drop before I'd even broken the seal. A cover letter from the Calvert family attorney, addressed to both Beau and myself, informing us that given certain unresolved concerns regarding the child's welfare and household stability, the family had retained counsel to pursue formal mediation regarding custodial arrangements. To commence within the month. I read it standing in the doorway with Marigold on my hip, and somewhere behind me I heard Beau's truck pull into the drive, home early for once. Home at exactly the wrong moment to explain exactly nothing at all. He came up the porch steps 2 at a time when he saw my face, and I simply held the letter out to him without a word. I watched the color drain slowly from his face as he reached the paragraph naming a real date. A real conference room, somewhere on the mainland, where strangers would sit in judgment of whether I was fit to raise my own daughter. "I didn't authorize this," he said, and his voice had a hollow, disbelieving quality I hadn't heard from him before. "Winnie, I swear to you, I told him we needed more time. I told him I wasn't ready to—" "You don't get to decide when you're ready," I said. "This is happening whether either of us is ready or not." He looked past me into the house, toward the sound of Celeste's voice in the kitchen, humming low and old to Marigold while she warmed a bottle, and his whole face crumpled in a way I had never seen before. Not shame exactly, but the grief of a man realizing all at once the size of the machine he'd been feeding his whole life without ever once asking what it was building toward. "I'm scared," he said, so quietly I almost missed it. "I'm scared of what happens if he wins this. And I'm scared of what it means about me, that some part of me still can't bring myself to stand all the way against him." I didn't have an answer for him. I only had my daughter, asleep against her grandmother's shoulder in the next room, and a folder full of language designed to take her from me, and a growing, unshakable certainty that whatever happened next, I would need to be strong enough to stand on my own, regardless of which way my husband finally chose to lean. Chapter 6. I bought a plain composition notebook from the same hardware store Caleb had gotten mine from, and I began, without quite deciding to, keeping a record. Not of my feelings. Of facts. The date and time of every pediatrician visit, and who was present. Every night I fed Marigold alone. Every night Beau came home after she was already asleep, every promise circled on the kitchen calendar and the outcome beside it in my own plain handwriting. I did not do it out of spite. I did it the way you'd shore up a foundation you suspected might be tested, quietly, methodically, because I had learned the hard way that a woman's memory alone was never going to be enough to stand against a folder full of someone else's careful language. There was something steadying in the ritual of it. Even so, each night after Marigold finally settled, I'd sit at the kitchen table with that notebook open under the lamp and write down whatever small, unremarkable truth the day had handed me. Fed her at first light alone, Beau home for dinner, stayed the whole evening, read to her before bed. I recorded the good nights as faithfully as the bad ones. Because I understood even then that whatever came of this, I wanted a record that was honest, rather than merely useful. Celeste was doing something similar, though I didn't learn the full extent of it until she showed up one afternoon with a cardboard box balanced on her hip, its corners soft with age, and set it on my kitchen table like she was setting down something that might still bite her. "I've kept a journal since before Beau was born," she said. "Every year a new one. I never let myself throw a single page away. Though God knows there were nights I wanted to burn every one of them." She lifted the lid, and I saw, packed tight and neat, decades of thin cloth-bound books, their spines cracked soft from handling. I never imagined anyone else would ever read a word of it. I kept it for myself, I think, so that somewhere, in some form, the truth of my own life would exist, even if I never had the courage to say it out loud. I didn't ask her what was in them. I understood, watching her hands rest on that box, that some things had to be offered rather than requested. "I haven't decided yet what I'm going to do with these," she admitted, her fingers resting light on the lid, like she wasn't quite ready to let it go. "Part of me wants to burn the whole box and be done with carrying it. But another part of me thinks maybe I kept it this long for exactly this reason, even if I didn't know it at the time. Maybe some things you write down not because you're ready to say them, but because you're leaving a door open for the day you finally are." She left the box with me that afternoon, tucked on the top shelf of the hall closet, and I did not open it. I only knew it was there, patient and heavy with years of a good woman's silence, waiting for whichever one of us found the courage to use it. Caleb and I finished the last of the shed's framing that same week. And for the first time since the work began, we sat afterward on the tailgate of his truck instead of parting ways at the end of the day, sharing a thermos of coffee gone lukewarm in the late afternoon heat. "You've been quiet today," he said. "There's a lot happening I can't really talk about. Didn't ask you to talk about it." He looked out at the marsh instead of at me, giving me room, the way he always seemed to know how to do. "Just noticed is all. Figured you'd tell me what you wanted me to know, in your own time." I found myself telling him more than I'd planned to. Not the legal details, not Garrison's name, but the shape of it. The fear of losing something I hadn't even finished building. The strange loneliness of being surrounded by people who loved you, and still feeling some nights entirely unheld. "I know something about that," he said when I'd finished. "Losing my mother taught me that a house can be full of people who love you and still feel like the emptiest room in the world. If the one person you need to hear you doesn't." He turned to look at me then, and there was nothing careless in it, nothing rushed. "I'm not going anywhere, Winnie. I want you to know that whatever happens with all this, whatever you decide, I'm not going anywhere." I did not know what to say to that, so for a moment I said nothing at all. And he let the silence sit between us without trying to fill it, which was, I was learning, exactly the kind of man he was. When I finally spoke, it wasn't about Beau or Garrison or the mediation waiting at the end of the month. It was about the shed, about how the light would fall through the new windows once the glass was in, about whether the old growing beds could still be saved or needed to be rebuilt from scratch. He answered every question like it mattered as much as anything else we might have talked about that evening. And by the time the coffee had gone cold in the thermos, some tight, guarded place in my chest had loosened another notch. The dinner happened 2 nights later. An annual thing, the Calvert family's harvest gathering, held every year on the lawn behind the main house with the whole extended family and half the island's old money in attendance. I had dreaded it since the invitation arrived. And I had been right too. Garrison waited until the toasts had started, until the wine had loosened the crowd enough that his words would carry the particular weight of something said in front of witnesses. And then he raised his glass and turned it deliberately toward me. "To family," he said, smiling in a way that did not reach his eyes. "Real family. The kind built on generations of stewardship, of knowing how to hold on to what matters and pass it down whole. I understand Winnie's been busy lately, out at that old shed on Harrington, trying to build something of her own. A ripple of polite laughter moved through the crowd, uncertain of its target but willing to laugh anyway. I do hope she understands that land use out that way falls under some fairly particular zoning considerations. The county board and I go back a long way. It would be a shame if a permit issue interrupted her little project, especially at a time when this family is trying so hard to project stability. The threat landed exactly as he'd aimed it, plain enough for me to understand completely and vague enough that no one else in that crowd would ever think to call it one. I felt the blood leave my face. Beside me, I felt Beau go rigid, and across the table I watched Celeste set down her wineglass with a small, precise click that carried further than it should have in the sudden hush. "Garrison," she said, her voice pitched to reach every ear on that lawn. "I don't believe I've ever heard you toast a woman's hard work by threatening to take it away from her. Perhaps you'd like to try that toast again." The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had ever heard. Garrison's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went flat and cold behind it, the look of a man recalculating in real time. And I understood that Celeste had just done, in front of that entire lawn, what she had never once done in decades of marriage. She had contradicted him plainly, publicly, without apology. "Of course," he said finally, lifting his glass again with a smoothness that almost covered the crack beneath it. "The family, however it's built." He drank without waiting for anyone else to join him, and the moment passed the way these things always seemed to in that family, swallowed whole and never spoken of again, though I caught more than one guest's eyes flicking toward me for the rest of the evening, with a curiosity that had nothing kind in it. Beau found me near the dock afterward, where I'd slipped away to breathe air that didn't taste like his father's cologne. "I'm sorry," he said. "I should have said something, right there in front of everyone. I should have. Why didn't you?" He didn't have an answer, and for once he didn't try to invent one. We stood there a long time in silence, watching the last light drain out of the marsh, and I understood that his silence on that dock was its own kind of answer, clearer than anything he could have said. Behind us, the party carried on without either of us, laughter and string lights and the clink of glasses, and I found myself thinking that I had never in my life felt so surrounded and so alone in the same breath. Chapter 7. Celeste came to the guest cottage the evening before the mediation was set to begin, the cardboard box of journals in her arms again, and this time she carried it straight past me into the kitchen and set it down like a decision already made. "I called Garrison this afternoon," she said. "I told him I intend to speak on your behalf tomorrow plainly, and that I will not be managed out of the room the way I've let myself be managed out of every difficult conversation in this family for longer than I care to admit." "What did he say?" He laughed at first. "Told me I didn't understand what was at stake for the business if this got messy. I told him I understood exactly what was at stake, better than he did, because I had spent my whole marriage watching him decide what mattered and what didn't, and I was done letting him make that decision for me." She pulled out a kitchen chair and sat, suddenly looking older than I had ever seen her look, though her voice never lost its steadiness. "He stopped laughing after that. He told me if I testified against my own son, I shouldn't expect an easy homecoming. I told him I had already made peace with whatever came after, and Beau, does he know? Not yet. I wanted you to hear it from me first, so you'd know exactly where I stand before you walk into that room tomorrow." She reached into the box and drew out a single journal, older than the rest, its cover soft and dark with handling, and set it on the table between us without opening it. "I've marked the pages I intend to read from if it comes to that. I want you to know what's in them before anyone else does. I don't want you blindsided by my own history tomorrow, on top of everything else you're carrying." I sat down across from her, my hand finding hers across the table without either of us quite planning it. "Celeste, you don't have to—" "I do," she said simply. "Not for you, though I love you like my own. For me, I've spent the better part of my life being the woman who smoothed things over, and I'm so tired, Winnie. I'm so tired of being tired." Beau found us like that when he came in from the truck, his face already braced for whatever news might be waiting. He looked at the box on the table, at his mother's steady hand in mine, and his shoulders sagged, as if he already understood the shape of what had been decided without either of us saying a word. "Mama," he said, his voice barely above the sound of the tide, "you don't have to do this." "I know I don't have to," Celeste said. "I'm choosing to. There's a difference, and it's taken me most of my life to learn it." He didn't argue further. He simply pulled out the third chair and sat with us. And for a while none of us said anything at all. The three of us keeping vigil together over a box of old journals and everything they were about to cost. "Mama," Beau said eventually, his voice rough, "why didn't you ever tell me any of this? Growing up, I mean, I always thought you and Daddy just had a quiet marriage. I never once thought you weren't supposed to think anything," Celeste said, not unkindly. "That was the whole point of hiding it so well. I wanted you to have a childhood that felt safe, even if mine didn't always feel that way underneath it. I see now that all I really did was teach you the same lesson I'd learned myself, that love means absorbing whatever you're handed and calling it strength." She reached over and took his hand, the same way she'd taken mine a moment before. "I don't regret protecting you from it when you were small. I do regret never once showing you what it looks like to stop absorbing it. I'm trying to show you now, while there's still time for it to matter." He didn't answer her, but he didn't pull his hand away either, and I watched a long, wordless reckoning pass between mother and son. Two people finally seeing each other plainly after years of practiced distance. I went out to the shed alone the next afternoon, needing air, needing my hands busy with something that had a clear and honest shape to it. Caleb was there finishing the last of the shelving, and when he saw my face he set down his tools without being asked and simply sat beside me on the old porch step my grandmother used to shell peas on. "Tomorrow's the day," he said. It wasn't a question. Tomorrow's the day. You scared, terrified. I hadn't said the word out loud to anyone yet, not even Celeste, and saying it to him felt like setting down something heavy I hadn't realized I was still carrying alone. What if it isn't enough? What if all the paper trails and all the good intentions in the world still aren't enough against a family that's never once lost anything they truly wanted to keep? He didn't rush to comfort me the way another man might have, all easy reassurance and empty promises. He sat with the question a while, turning a scrap of sandpaper over in his hands. And when he finally spoke, it was with the same careful honesty he brought to everything else. He was quiet for a long moment, watching the light move across the marsh grass. "I can't promise you it'll be enough," he said finally. "I wish I could. But I can tell you this, whatever happens in that room tomorrow, you built something real out here. Nobody can take that away from you on paper, no matter what they write down." He turned to look at me then, and his voice dropped lower, more careful. "And I can tell you that somewhere along the way, watching you do it, I started hoping for things I probably have no right to hope for yet. I'm not saying that to complicate tomorrow. I'm saying it because I don't want to keep pretending it isn't true." I didn't answer him with words. I reached over and laced my fingers through his just for a moment, just long enough to say what I wasn't ready to say out loud yet either. And then I let go because tomorrow needed all of me. And this, whatever this was becoming, could wait for a day when I had more of myself to give it. That night, Beau found me on the back porch after Marigold was finally asleep, and he sat down beside me without asking permission, which was, in its own small way, the first time, in longer than I could remember, that he'd simply shown up without being summoned. "I keep thinking about my father," he said, staring out at the dark water, "about how every memory I have of him is either him working or him disappointed that I wasn't. I used to swear I'd be different. And then Marigold came, and some part of me panicked so hard I ran straight toward the one thing I know how to do, which is close a deal and make him proud, instead of the one thing I'd never learned how to do at all, which is just be there. That's not an excuse," I said. "I know it's not. I'm not offering it as one." He turned to look at me, and his eyes were wet in the porch light. "I'm just trying to tell you the truth for once, instead of something that sounds better. I don't know if I'm going to be able to become the man you need. I want to. Wanting to hasn't ever seemed to be enough. No, I said quietly. It hasn't. He nodded like he'd expected that answer and needed to hear it said plainly anyway. Whatever happens tomorrow, he said, I want you to know I'm not going to fight my father's version of this. If Mama testifies, I'm not going to sit there and let his lawyer tear her apart without saying something. I don't know yet what that's going to cost me. I just know I'm done letting him decide what I'm willing to lose. It was the closest thing to a real promise he had made me since the night Marigold was born, and I did not know yet whether to trust it. I only knew that some small, stubborn part of me wanted to. Neither of us said anything else. We sat together in the dark, listening to the tide working its slow way back in, across the mudflats. And somewhere behind us, through the thin nursery window, I could hear Marigold's small, even breathing, entirely unaware of the morning waiting to arrive and decide, in some cold room on the mainland, the shape of the rest of her childhood. I did not sleep much that night. I lay awake beside a husband who had, for the first time in longer than I could remember, told me the truth without softening it, and I thought about all the women who had come before me in this family and this place. My grandmother, curing greens in a shed she built with her own hands. Celeste, keeping a silent record of everything she was too afraid to say out loud. My own mother, working double shifts and warning me, in her own tired way, never to hand my whole self over to people who hadn't earned it. I thought I understood finally, lying in the dark with morning still hours away, exactly what all of them had been trying to teach me. Tomorrow, I intended to prove I had learned it. Chapter 8. The mediator's office sat on the second floor of a converted cotton warehouse near the Brunswick waterfront. All exposed brick and tall windows that let in more light than seemed fair for a room where so much was about to be decided. Her name was Miss Devereux, a small, sharp-eyed woman who shook my hand first, before Bowes, before Garrison's, and told us plainly at the outset that her only concern in that room was the welfare of one child, and that she had no patience for theatre. Garrison's attorney, a lean man named Mr. Paget, with a voice like a closing argument, even when he was only asking someone to pass the water pitcher, laid out the family's position first. He spoke of stability. He spoke of resources. He spoke, carefully, delicately, of a mother's documented emotional strain during a difficult postpartum period. And I felt the whole of that phrase land in my chest, exactly as it had the day I first read it alone in Beau's office. Then it was my turn. I had brought the notebook. I laid it open on the table and did not raise my voice once, because I had promised myself, lying awake the night before, that I would let the facts do whatever shouting needed to be done. I read from my own record, patterns Miss Devereux could see plainly on the page. The long, unbroken column of nights I had fed my daughter alone against the shorter column of nights I hadn't. I read the appointments I'd attended alone. I read the calendar entries in Beau's own handwriting, circled and later crossed out. I did not call Beau a bad man. I simply laid out in my own steady handwriting exactly how many times I had shown up and exactly how many times I hadn't needed to prove I could. My hands were shaking by the time I closed the notebook, though I hadn't let my voice shake once, and I understood, setting it down on the table between us, that I had just handed a room full of strangers the most honest record of my marriage that existed anywhere in the world. This is not a portrait of instability, I said. This is a portrait of a woman who kept showing up, whether or not anyone else did. Mr. Paget tried, gently at first and then less gently, to suggest that grief and exhaustion following childbirth were themselves a kind of instability, that any reasonable family would want safeguards in place. I felt my hands go cold under the table. And then Celeste stood. She hadn't been asked to. Miss Devereux glanced at her, surprised, and Garrison's jaw tightened in a way I recognized now as his particular flavor of fury. Controlled and silent and somehow louder than shouting. I'd like to speak if I may, Celeste said. I am this child's grandmother. I was present for her birth. I believe what I witnessed is relevant. Miss Devereux nodded. and Celeste opened the journal she'd carried in with her. The old one, its cover soft with handling, and for a moment her hands trembled visibly over the page before she steadied them. "Say I'm not here today because my son asked me to be," she said. "I'm here despite the fact that my husband made it very clear I would pay a price for it. I have decided that price is worth paying, because I have spent the better part of my life staying silent to protect this family's comfort, and I have watched that silence very nearly cost my daughter-in-law her voice in her own child's life the same way it cost me mine." She read then from the journal. Not everything. She'd marked 3 passages, she told the room, and she would read only those. But even 3 passages were enough to still every other sound in that space. She read about a summer years ago, a hospital, a husband who arrived a full day late. She read about small cruelties dressed as concern, comments about her own unsuitability for a family like this one, delivered so gently across so many years that she hadn't recognized the pattern until she watched it beginning again, aimed this time at me. She read one passage near the end, written not long after Beau was born, that described a young mother sitting alone in a nursery at night, rocking her son and promising him out loud to a room with no one in it to hear, that she would never let him grow up, believing coldness was the same thing as strength. Her voice caught there just once on the word promising, and she stopped, pressed her fingers briefly to her mouth, and then continued anyway. "I did not keep that promise," she said. "I watched him grow up in a house that taught him exactly what I swore he wouldn't learn, because I never once had the courage to teach him anything different out loud. I'm not here today to defend myself. I'm here to make sure this room understands that whatever failure my son is guilty of, it did not begin with him." Her voice did not break, though I could see what it cost her to keep it from breaking. "I'm not asking this room to punish my son," she said, closing the journal. "I'm asking it to see clearly what I did not have the courage to name for most of my life, so that this family does not spend another generation mistaking silence for peace." Garrison did not look at her once while she read. He stared straight ahead at some fixed point on the wall, his face a mask of the same controlled stillness I had come to recognize as his only real emotion. And when she finished, the silence in that room had a weight to it I have never felt before or since. Beau was the one who finally broke it. He stood, slowly, and when he spoke, his voice had none of its usual polish, none of the practiced ease he used in every room he'd ever walked into. "I want to withdraw my father's position," he said, "all of it. The framework, the language about instability, all of it. I should have said this before we ever walked into this room. And I'm ashamed it took watching my mother do something braver than anything I've done in my whole life to finally say it." "Beauregard," Garrison said, low and warning, the first words he'd spoken since Celeste sat back down. "No." "Daddy!" Beau's voice shook, but he didn't stop. "I missed my daughter's birth because I was too scared of becoming you to notice I already had. I'm not going to let you write my wife out of our daughter's life on paper the way you wrote Mama out of your marriage in every way that wasn't paper. I'm done. I'm done letting you decide what kind of man I get to be." Miss Devereux let the silence hold a long moment before she spoke again, her voice even and unhurried, entirely unmoved by the wreckage scattered across that bright sunlit room. "I'll need time to review everything presented today before I draft recommendations," she said. "I don't make these decisions quickly, and I won't be rushed by anyone's discomfort. We'll reconvene in the morning." The meeting ended without a verdict, without the clean, satisfying resolution I had, despite myself, been hoping for. Garrison left first, alone, without a word to any of us. Celeste followed more slowly, her shoulders squared in a way that looked less like triumph than like a woman who had simply run out of anything left to lose by standing up straight. I found Beau in the hallway afterward, sitting on a bench beneath one of the tall windows, his head in his hands. Down the corridor I could see Celeste through a half-open door. Still sitting where the mediation had left her, the journal closed in her lap. staring at nothing in particular with the exhausted stillness of a woman who has just set down something she has carried for most of her life. "I don't know if that was enough," Bo said without looking up. "I don't know if anything I said in there undoes what I didn't do the night she was born." "I don't know either," I said honestly. He looked up at me then, his eyes red-rimmed. And for the first time since I'd known him, I watched Bo Calvert wait for an answer he had absolutely no power to demand. "Winnie," he said, "whatever Miss Devereaux decides tomorrow, am I going to lose you too?" I did not have an answer for him. I only had the sound of the tide somewhere beyond that warehouse window, working its slow way in and out the way it always had, indifferent to every decision being made in every room built along its edges. And I stood there beside my husband in the fading light with no idea at all what I was going to say when morning came. Celeste found us there a few minutes later, the journal tucked under her arm, and though her face was pale and drawn, there was something in it I had not seen since the night Marigold was born, a kind of loosened peace, hard-won and unfamiliar, the look of a woman who had finally set down a weight she'd carried so long she'd nearly forgotten it wasn't simply part of her own body. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said quietly, looking at both of us, "I want you to know I don't regret a single word of it." Not one. None of us said much else on the drive back to the island. The causeway lights strung out gold across the water, exactly as they had the night Marigold was born, and I watched them blur past the window and thought with a strange, tired clarity that I had no idea what kind of family I would wake up belonging to in the morning. Chapter 9. Miss Devereaux's recommendation arrived the following morning, in language far plainer than anything in Garrison's original folder. Primary residence and day-to-day decision-making would remain with me. Bo would have full, unsupervised time with Marigold, structured at first around a schedule we would build together, with room to grow as trust between us grew alongside it. No mention of instability, no mention of a paternal household. Just two parents, named plainly, asked to do better by a child neither of them had any excuse not to show up for. I read it standing in the kitchen with Marigold on my hip, and I did not cry, though I came close. It was not the sweeping vindication some part of me had wanted, no dramatic undoing of every hurt, no public reckoning for Garrison beyond the quiet, permanent knowledge that his own wife had chosen to speak against him. It was simply fair. After everything, fair felt like more than I had let myself hope for. There was a note at the bottom of the recommendation, in Miss Devereaux's own hand, rather than her attorney's careful typescript, that I read 3 times before I understood why it moved me the way it did. The record submitted by the child's grandmother, it said, reflects a family's willingness to examine its own patterns honestly rather than simply defend them. That willingness should be recognized, not punished. I thought of Celeste's trembling hands over that old journal, of the price Garrison had promised her for speaking, and I folded the paper carefully and set it somewhere I would be able to find it again on the hard days. Whenever they came, Bo took the news standing very still in the doorway, and when he finally spoke, his voice was thick. "I'm not going to waste this," he said. "I know I've said things like that before. I'm asking you to let me prove it this time instead of just saying it. I'm not going to stop you from trying," I said. "But I need you to understand something, Bo. I'm not rushing back into anything. Not the way things were. I have spent a year learning how to stand on my own. And I'm not setting that down just because a piece of paper came back in my favor." He nodded slowly, and something in his face told me he'd expected that answer, maybe even needed to hear it. "That's fair," he said. "I'll take whatever pace you need. I just don't want to lose the chance to earn it back." He started small in the weeks that followed, in ways that surprised me more than any grand gesture could have. He found a therapist on his own, without being asked, and mentioned it to me only once in passing, like a man still uncertain whether he'd earned the right to be praised for something so basic. He showed up for every visit with Marigold exactly when he said he would, and when he was 5 minutes late one Tuesday, caught behind a slow-moving shrimp boat trailer on the causeway, He called ahead to say so instead of simply arriving late and hoping I hadn't noticed. It was such a small thing. I found myself, against my own better judgment, keeping a private tally of small things, the way I once had of absences, and watching the column slowly begin to even out. Garrison did not come by the house that week or the next. When Celeste finally spoke to him, she told me only that he had said very little, that something in him had gone quiet in a way she didn't yet know how to read. Whether it was shame or simple recalculation of what this family's image now required. She did not seem particularly interested in finding out which. I think for the first time in our marriage, he doesn't quite know what to do with me, she told me, a small, tired wonder in her voice. He spent so many years counting on my silence that he never once built a plan for what happens if I stopped giving it to him. I find I don't much mind watching him work that out on his own. I did not know then whether Garrison Calvert would ever soften, whether the coldness at the center of him was the kind that could still be thawed, or the kind that simply calcifies further with age. I only knew that Celeste no longer seemed to be waiting on the answer, and that watching her stop waiting was its own quiet. Remarkable thing to witness. I've made a decision, she told me instead one warm afternoon out at the shed, where the last of the new windows had finally gone in and the whole space had begun, at last, to look like the growing room my grandmother once kept. I'm having the deed to Harrington transferred, the land, the shed, all of it, fully into your name. Not the family's, not Beau's, yours. Celeste, I can't let you. You're not letting me do anything. I already spoke to my own attorney, separate from the family's, and it's already in motion. She looked out at the greenhouse, its new glass catching the afternoon light, and her voice softened. I'm not doing this to rescue you, Winnie. You have never once needed rescuing, not from the day I met you. I'm doing this because I refuse to let this family hold one more thing over your head that they could threaten to take away. This is yours. It was always going to be yours. I'm simply making sure no one can pretend otherwise. I hugged her before I could think better of it, and she held on longer than either of us expected. And for a moment, neither of us said anything at all. Standing together in the shed my grandmother built with her own 2 hands. Now safe, on paper and in truth in mine, Louvenia called that same evening, her voice careful in a way I recognized as her particular brand of apology. The kind that never used the actual word. I heard how it turned out, she said. Word travels, even out here. I'm glad, Winnie. I truly am. Thank you, Mama. There was a pause, longer than usual, and when she spoke again her voice had lost some of its guard. I know I haven't made this easy on you. All my warnings, all my told-you-sos. I think some part of me was just so scared of watching you get hurt that I forgot how to just be glad for you instead. Another pause. I'm working on it. I can't promise I'll get it right every time, but I'm working on it. It was not everything I had wanted from her, not the wholehearted embrace I used to dream about as a girl, but it was more than she had ever offered before, and I understood, hanging up the phone, that some bridges get rebuilt one careful plank at a time rather than all at once, and that I was finally willing to be patient with the process instead of demanding it arrive whole. I found Caleb at the shed the next evening, sweeping the last of the sawdust from the new floor, and I stood in the doorway a long moment just watching him work before he noticed me. The late light came slanting gold through the new glass, catching the dust he stirred up in slow, drifting spirals, and I thought, watching him, that I had never once seen this space look so entirely alive. It's finished, he said, when he finally looked up, gesturing at the room around us, the new glass, the rebuilt beds, the shelving he'd built with his own hands over months of patient, unhurried work. It's finished, I agreed. So what happens now? I crossed the room to him, past the empty growing beds waiting for their first real planting, and I did not have a speech prepared. No careful accounting of everything that had happened or everything that still might. I only had the truth, plain and unhurried, the way he had always given it to me. Now I plant something, I said, and I'd like it very much if you were still here to watch it grow. He smiled, slow and certain, and reached for my hand the way he had that evening on the tailgate. Except this time, neither of us let go. We stood there a while longer in that quiet, finished room, listening to the marsh settling into evening beyond the new windows. And I found myself thinking that everything I had lost that year had, in its own strange way, made room for everything now standing in front of me. My daughter, my mother-in-law's fierce, unshakable love, a piece of land safely, permanently my own. And this man, patient and steady, holding my hand in a room he'd helped me save, waiting to see what I planted next. Chapter 10. The marigolds came up first that spring, bright and stubborn along the edge of the growing beds, exactly where I'd planted them the week the shed was finished. I hadn't planned it that way. I only knew, kneeling in the dirt with a package of seeds in my hand, that I wanted something with my daughter's name blooming somewhere I'd see it every single morning. The business had a name now, painted in careful letters on a reclaimed cypress board Caleb had hung above the shed door. Harrington Blooms. Word had spread slow and steady the way things do on an island this size, first through the church, then through the village shops, until I found myself, most weeks, turning away more wedding work than I could take on alone. I had hired my first helper that spring, a bright, quick-handed girl from down the road who reminded me, some mornings, of exactly who I used to be before I let myself get small. My mother drove down for the shop's opening weekend, the first time she'd made the trip in longer than either of us cared to admit, and I watched her walk the growing beds with her hands clasped behind her back, studying each row like she was memorizing it. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said finally. "I'm proud." "I don't say that near enough, and I know it. You're saying it now. I'm trying to say a lot of things now, before I run out of time to say them." She reached out and touched a marigold bloom, gentle, like it might bruise. "I was so scared of you getting hurt that I forgot to let you get happy too. I'm sorry for that, Winnie. Truly." I hugged her there among the flowers, and it was not a perfect reconciliation, not the kind that erases years of careful distance in a single afternoon. But it was real, and it was hers to give in her own time, and I had finally learned not to need it to be more than that. Celeste came out most Sunday afternoons, still in her church clothes, and sat on the old porch step while I worked, the two of us talking about nothing and everything the way we always had. She'd taken to keeping a fresh journal again, she told me one afternoon, though this one she wrote in without any of the old fear, just for the pleasure of setting a good day down on paper before it slipped away. I used to think a good life meant nothing worth writing down ever happened in it, she said, turning a zinnia stem slowly between her fingers. Now I think a good life is one you're finally not afraid to put into words. I heard your father-in-law finally agreed to therapy, she said one Sunday, watching me bundle a fresh batch of zinnias. His own idea, if you can believe it. I don't know that it'll change him. I've stopped needing it to, if I'm honest. I'm just glad I'm not waiting on it anymore. Bo still came every week right on schedule, and some Sundays he stayed for supper, and some Sundays he simply took Marigold down to the water and back. The two of them returning sandy and sunburned and laughing about something only they seemed to understand. He'd started teaching her the names of the shorebirds, the way his own grandfather had once taught him, and I'd catch her some evenings standing at the window pointing out egrets like she was reciting a lesson she was proud to have learned. We were not what we used to be. I do not know if we ever will be again, or if I even want that particular thing back. But he showed up now, steady and unglamorous week after week, and I had learned slowly to let that be enough without demanding it become more than it honestly was. Caleb built me a proper work table that spring, out of the same heart pine as the original framing, and carved a single marigold into the corner of it without telling me first. I found it one morning, running my hand absently along the grain, and when I looked up, he was watching me from across the shed with an expression I had come, over the months, to know by heart. "You didn't have to do that," I said, the same words I'd said to him once before. A lifetime ago, it seemed, over a $5 notebook. "I know," he said exactly as he had then. "Didn't do it because I had to. That evening, After the shop had closed and Marigold was down for the night, he and I sat together on the porch step my grandmother used to shell peas on, watching the tide go out slow and easy across the flats. The whole marsh turning gold and then grey and then finally dark. I thought about the woman I'd been the night my daughter was born, alone and frightened, and listening for a door that wouldn't open. I thought about everything that had grown, unhurried and unglamorous, in the year since, not because anyone had rescued me, but because I had finally let myself be patient with the slow, ordinary work of building something real. Penny for your thoughts. Mark, Caleb said. I leaned my head against his shoulder and watched the last of the light go out over the water. Just thinking about everything still growing, I said. Even the parts I couldn't see yet. My queens, before we close the door on this one tonight, sit with me a moment longer. Every story we share is meant to leave you with something to carry into your own life, and this one left me with a few things I want to name plainly. 1. Silence does not keep the peace. It only postpones the reckoning, and it hands the bill to whoever comes after you. Celeste learned that the hard way, and she spent the back half of her life making sure her silence didn't become anyone else's inheritance. 2. A love that shows up in small, steady ways will outlast a love that only shows up in grand apologies. Watch what people do after they've disappointed you. That is where the truth lives. 3. You do not have to share someone's blood to be their family. Sometimes the people who choose you on purpose in the hardest moments are more your family than the ones who were simply assigned to you at birth. 4. Protect your own record. Keep your own account of your life, in your own words, even when you hope you'll never need it. The truth is always stronger when it's been written down plainly, one honest day at a time, instead of pieced together after the fact. 5. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. You are allowed to forgive someone for your own peace and still take your time deciding how close you let them back in. 6. Whatever was torn down in your life can be rebuilt, board by board, if you're patient enough with the work and honest enough to ask for help when you need it. Thank you for spending this time with me, queens. Rest well tonight, and I'll see you again soon. With love, Mr. Peter.